So this history of art, I think, has played around this circle, but every now and again it goes into the centre and we see the visionary at work, or the artist that taps into a, let's say, super consciousness. They go beyond the five senses, and every now and again you see that where there's been an elevation in terms of moving to one level of awareness into another perception of what's going on in the world. And I'll give you an example. Every now and again through history you have people that are seen as they would be seen as a genius, or an eccentric, or even deemed as being mad or crazy. And I'm talking about art now, not necessarily other areas. And people like William Blake, Van Gogh, all these people look to be eccentric at one point in this so-called circular history, but in actual fact they were always strongly connected to the centre of the circle, which was their imagination, their super consciousness. They had a shamanic ability to them, but the modern society at the time portrayed them as probably being slightly mad because they didn't fit within the structure of that time, to the point where they were marginalised. And how many artists even today still feel like they're marginalised by a system that is focused purely on the five senses, and even more so focused on death rather than life. I think it's changed, Jonnie. You know, what you have is a kind of one of the main themes, I suppose, has been constantly connecting with archetypes. And the archetypes are, you know, when you think about the study of Jung and other people, but mainly Jung, we have these classic archetypes that are part of that oral, traditional, symbolic language. And I've tried to use that and then go above it and beyond it in many ways. But, you know, themes like people used to make fun, say, you know, oh, you're doing another Christmas card painting, for example. You know, are you going to include any aliens in it? So, you know, the idea of painting things necessarily that aren't seen. So painting things that we don't see. Because really, if you think about it, art, I mean, I love the fact that art, people paint whatever they want to paint, but for me, art's about painting what we don't see. Otherwise, there would be no point. If I wanted to copy something, imitate reality, then that's fine. There's a technique involved in that. It's great, and there's some skill, real skill in trying to do that. But it doesn't set my soul on fire. It doesn't make me connect with that place in the centre, that infinite source of super consciousness that exists within us, and all about us. So art has to be tapping into things that are unseen, realms of reality that we don't necessarily see with the naked eye. I think it's not just art that can empower you. It's obviously there's other areas as well. But yeah, if you're making art, what you're naturally doing is moving out of time. You're moving out of this timelessness, this connection to the grid, as I call it, or the world that locks us into logic and this reality. If you're not engaged in art, or you're not engaged in creativity, then you're in some way you're missing out. If creativity is poetry, if it's singing, dancing, music, writing, doesn't matter what it is, it can be anything. But ultimately, you're going into a timeless zone, a dreamlike space, like daydreaming, which allows you to be connected to these other levels of yourself, these other levels of reality. Zoning out and switching off is so crucial. That's why the education system is detrimental in many ways to a lot of people, because it doesn't allow kids that time to zone out. I mean, when I was zoning out as a kid, it was probably easier back in the day. There was less distraction. I mean, today we're absolutely saturated with technology. It's one of the, it's a blessing, but it's also really bad, in as much that it's taken us away from that connection. I mean, the amount of people that spend time on electronic devices, you know, reading and looking at pads. I mean, I see people walking around all the time while they're walking and texting. You're looking at an almost a mutation taking place within our lifetime, a mutation of the next generation, which are locked into technology so deeply because it's been too readily available. The technology is not allowing us to have that zoning out period. It's making people not want to read books. I read an article somewhere by Dr. Greenwood at the Oxford University professor talking about technology taking the next generation away from the basic activities of reading, as an example, because the waves in the brain are changing. It's rewiring the brain in simple terms, and it's making people not want to engage in certain things that we would naturally have done. We would have done anyway. If the technology wasn't there. So if the technology wasn't there, then we would be reading and doing other things. And you look at kids today. I mean, some kids today are even given pads and androids and things from an early age. It's not good. In my view, it's not good, because it's actually stopping this natural connection to something which is above and beyond the five sense reality, which is so entrenched in technology now. We have to break that connection in some ways, and one of the ways to break the connection is through creativity, through the creative imagination. That's why if you leave a child to just get on with drawing and making and creating without any prejudice or limitation or lack of worry or fear of what somebody else might think of what they're doing, which children do naturally, you are massaging that kind of connection to the imagination. Play is another example. Art is play. If you're playing with paints, you're playing and you're exploring, it's no different to a child playing with a toy. The only difference is maybe you might have an agenda. Sometimes play has an agenda, but sometimes it's just play. It just goes and meanders like a river somewhere, and to a point where you come round from the play and you say, oh, where was I for the past 2 or 3 hours? And that's what painting does. You know, you could start painting, as I started with this painting that day, that morning, back in 1994, and by the end of the day there was this face staring back at me, and the first thing that came into my head was a watcher. And I didn't know what that meant at the time. I've looked into it since, and I know what that relates to. And you know, you're talking about, again, connections to what we would perceive to be deities and entities and all these other levels of reality. Some people are calling them ETs today. I don't necessarily think it's give something a name and you can limit it. I think it's more to do with the fact that there are other levels of reality that personify themselves through our creativity and our imagination, that we then pinpoint and focus on to give them life in this world. These things exist, but they don't exist in this matrix, this grid that we're in. We have to go somewhere else to make that connection with them. This is one of the oldest paintings. There's quite a few, but this is a really old painting for me. I painted this in London. There was a period for me when I worked and lived in London in the early 90s, and it's a great example of what I'm talking about, because this painting one day, and anybody who paints will know this, or anybody who makes art will understand what I'm talking about. This painting came from nowhere. I got up one morning in a studio the same size as this. I've always worked in a very small confided space, as I say, and I cracked open a canvas, or I stretched a canvas in this case. This is one that I made, and I just decided I was going to just paint what came through that day, and behold came the Watcher. It's a very old painting. It's 93, 92, 93, I think. 94, sorry, 94. And there's some significance behind it, because I'd always felt a connection to certain, let's say, mythological creatures and entities and things in stories that I'd read about over the years. But I didn't know what this was, and I painted it, and somebody said to me at the time, "What is that? It looks like a monkey, looks like a tree, looks like an owl." And in actual fact, when you get to that level of painting and interacting with things that are unseen, a painting can take on many different forms. It doesn't have to be a painting like this, of course. It could be a landscape, it could be anything, it could be a dreamscape, it could be whatever it is, it could be abstract. This isn't abstract, of course, it's a sort of literal, surreal image. I painted it, of course, and I took about a day to do, and it's been with me ever since. But what's weird, I put together a book about 12 years ago. And that book, which is no longer in print, I'd come across these kind of Syrian images on artifacts, as sculptures they were, outside one of the temples, and it had these creatures on them, you know, like long-haired looking kind of bearded kind of alien-like creatures. And I'd not seen that when I painted that. That just came through out of nowhere. It was many, many months later when I saw the book with the drawings in. I thought, blimey, that looks like them. You know, that looks like that kind of creature. Now, I'm not saying that they exist. What I'm saying is that in the realm of creative imagination, in the realm of the human realm of the imagination, everything exists. It doesn't matter whether people choose to believe it or not. The fact that we have imagination means that we can bring into reality anything that exists within that sea of consciousness. So we can manifest and change reality through the art of creative imagination. That's why art is a powerful tool for that. That's why art is constantly being undermined by the powers that be. Unless you're involved in the in club, unless you're involved as an elite artist in some way, you know, you're paid millions for whatever it is, whether it's a skull encrusted in diamonds or whatever it is, without naming names. These people are brought to the forefront and celebrated because of their focus on things that are keeping the general population focused on subjects that relate to decay and death and distraction, mediocrity, all those things. I think artists and people that want to go down that route have a responsibility to create work that comes from the power source within. Now, something like this came from within, came from without, within. It's the same thing. A bit above is below, and you know, and everywhere is nowhere. So that's been my driving connection. To go back to your question, driving connection through everything that I've done is to make an effort to set aside time, as such, if you want to call it that, to make imagery that speaks of a higher purpose and a higher connection to energy, to truth, to vibrations that are more than this world. I mean, I've had some dreams that I wouldn't want to paint, you know, but yeah, they do, yeah. I mean, I've had artists come to me and tell me stories about what they've seen. There was a friend of mine told me a really lovely story once about a dream that she'd had, which was of a people standing on a hilltop, and the clouds in this dream were turning into what looked like giant personified faces, and they were being drawn towards the crowd that were all in white. And I found it quite interesting because she said one cloud, a big cloud, wouldn't turn around and face them, wouldn't turn its head to face the crowd. And I just found that fascinating, how we can, I mean, you know, how a dream can be so inspiring, yet to turn into a painting, but there's, more often than not, there's a deeper message behind it. I've had lots of dreams where I've been given insight into reality, the nature of the nature of reality, the plight, the future. The future can be the past as well, so it's not necessarily the future. You could be going back in time because we're looking at a circular motion. You've got little studies like this where you're sitting and you're working things out. So something comes with a certain amount of rapidity, but then you get in reference for it and you're looking at it, and then something of that nature can become something like this. Okay. As it works itself into another format, another version of what it is you're trying to achieve. And then there's a design element in me. There's a designer, an analytical person that wants to have a measure of something as I work through it. You know, I have a series of stages. I know what is a rough idea, what I'm trying to change into something else, how I'm trying to develop it, obviously, and then you've got other people that might have some say in the process, depending on what project it is you're working on. Well, this painting is from the same period as The Watcher. It was painted in London, in the London studio at that time, and I had my head in a lot of books through the mid-90s into the late 90s, books that were, let's say, books that are channeled, the idea of channeling information. And I found some of the books fascinating, purely because they were talking about concepts that I was seeing in dreams, and picking up on similar kind of bits of information. And this particular painting at that time was based on something that was to do with the Pleiadian consciousness, the idea of Pleiadians and Pleiadian agenda. There was a book called The Pleiadian Agenda. I remember it well, called, I think it was Barbara Hand-Clough, I think. And there's a couple of other ones. There's a Barbara Marciniak's book as well, Bringers of the Dawn. So it was that period, and I was very much interested in the channeled information. I was turning that into picture form. So this is one of the paintings. But like a lot of paintings, and I can't show you the others because I don't have them, they're not here, but they're very similar. There were about 3 or 4 of the same period, where the earth, the eye, the entity, the sun, the pyramids, the constellations were all coming into play in these paintings. One painting, which is very similar to this, I called it, back in 1993, Here Comes the Moon. I didn't know why I called it that, it just came to me. And I had this painting of what was essentially a kind of creature, a devil of some kind, blowing the moon towards the earth. And the moon here is attached to the earth in this way. But this painting, where it shows the moon was being blown, that actually got into the Best of British Illustration back in '93. It won an award as such. I don't even think the judges knew what they were selecting, because it was all about the fall of. I even used the word "fall of Atlantis" in the description. What's he talking about? Here comes the moon, the fall of Atlantis. So it was, I was, even in the mainstream illustration world, I was still involved in at that time. I was trying to break into these other subjects that you would never see in a million years in the commercial world. So this painting is, I called this, and it's in the same set of the others, I called it the 4th dimensional watchers. So it's the predator consciousness, the 4th dimensional watchers. I didn't know what that meant at the time, it just sounded right. And in recent years, I've discovered lots of other things to do with the eye symbolism, and the idea that this is the all-seeing eye. But actually what's interesting here is the constellation of Orion. And everybody who's read their stuff know that. The 3 main belt stars linked to the pyramids. The eye was more about the idea of some kind of God looking into what we would perceive as this world, like we look at goldfish in a goldfish bowl. So imagine for a second that we're all fish inside a bowl on one level of reality, going about our business, and then along comes something that is much bigger in terms of physicality, and he's staring into the goldfish bowl and looking into this world, hence the kind of lucidity of what this was about. Now, the goldfish have no understanding of what that is that's staring at them. They to try and understand the perception of a fish, how can a fish understand the life of a bird, and all these kind of philosophical thoughts that we can have. But the human entity that's staring into the goldfish is carrying with it a whole kind of different view of the world, of what's going on, and how much more power that they could have over the so-called goldfish inside their very limited bowl-like reality. So that's what this was about. This was an entity peering in to what we would perceive as a reality that is very much connected to Earth, Moon and Sun consciousness. The Orion Belt plays a big part in the story, because from my own sort of visionary feelings into things in meditation, the constellation of Orion is probably connected to other driving forces that are trying to change and meddle with our world in that way. So there's a big connection to Orion. This is also, when I think back now, it's also a symbol of the demiurge in the Gnostic teachings, it's also Saturn. So you've got the idea of Saturn, Satanism and all this kind of thing, symbolic as the eye staring in and the control it has over this reality. Now, whether the Earth's flat, whether the Earth's a sphere, whether it's a coffee table, I've looked at all this stuff over, recent months. And I don't think it matters. I mean, knowing the Earth's flat or everything is flat on one level, but knowing that it's flat or whatever it is, it's kind of irrelevant for me, because it's what we have is an illusionary sphere, a reality that something else is having an effect on. The passing bird god here, at the time when I painted it, related to the Pleiadians. So the Pleiadian consciousness, which was very, very, in my view, was quite malevolent. It wasn't something that was necessarily a good thing. I'm not saying that there isn't good Pleiadian consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, but in my view, this was passing by and it was indifferent. So you have this idea of an overall face, the face of our world, the face of or the vision of our reality, our plight, and the idea that the three-dimensional reality is very different to a fourth-dimensional reality, which is very different to a fifth-dimensional, sixth-dimensional, and so on and so on. As you get out of that limitation, that goldfish bowl, then you not only have the potential to travel into other areas and see other things, the illusion becomes expansive based on your ability to perceive outside of that very limited scope. So that's what the painting was about in some ways. There's other things as well, but that's the use of red and blue is quite important, because in all of the ancient myths there was a realm of deities that related to the red. They called them the red and the blue deities. And in South American cultures, they had names for them. They were connected to Quetzalcoatl and these other deities. And the red and the blue was something, if you look closely, without getting really into it in this interview, but if you look closely, you'll find the red and the blue symbolism within much of what we would call everyday life, from flags, insignias, superheroes, Superman, Spider-Man. Come to spiders in a second. The red pill and the blue pill in the Matrix movie. The red and the blue is quite an interesting colour combination, because the blue generally relates to, in terms of Aboriginal culture, the blue relates to what they called the stars, space. And the red related to the genetics, the blood of the earth, the physicality. And so you had genetics in terms of stars and genetics in terms of people. And when you look at the whole idea of holographic reality and the fact that brain cells can look like universes, this connection between red and blue were seen as opposing forces, or the duality of the illusion interplaying to create the structure for religions and beliefs and all those kind of things. So what I'm trying to say is that there had to be some kind of understanding of duality born within the mind of humanity to give them this notion to have religions and deities and all these other things within their very beliefs and life structures. It was given to them by other forces outside of their reality, like the god or the person that comes to the goldfish bowl and puts some food in the goldfish bowl for the fish to consume. Our beliefs were given to us. They were placed in the goldfish bowl so that we would consume them.
Wow.
And the blue and the red is symbolic of that underpinning blueprint that was the foundation for the beliefs and the structures. The little yellow focus there on the earth, that's meant to be Atlantis going under. So that's the last of the crystals that were sank, in my view, sank in Atlantis. So the earth mass, the nature of the hologram was shifting and changing here at the time when these forces were interplaying. It's oil, by the way, this. I don't normally paint in oil these days. I've just started painting in oil again. It's a real challenge when you've not used oil paint for such a long time to go back into that way of thinking. It's quite hard. I tend to use acrylic on canvas, which I like, because of the rapidity of it drying and being able to work with lines and detail, become obsessed with lines and detail in certain images. Whereas at this period, back in the 90s, I was more interested in the sort of dreamlike quality of the paint, and I was inspired by artists like Cecil Collins, who was the head of St Martin's up until he died in 1989. That was probably the most modern of the modernists up to the sensational period. Anything after that, I'd lost interest. But when I mean lost interest, I didn't really look at. And then obviously interested in all the post-impressionist painters and how they handled paint. I was fascinated by the way in which paint was pretty raw. Even today, it's not, we don't paint like that anymore. People have found other methods and media in terms of expressing themselves. Something like film, for example, is the modern day media now of the shamanic artist. That's why we have movies and blockbusters and things that are really, really designed to instill subconsciously a set of beliefs on the populations. Film is a medium for that, it's a tool for it.